Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the Natural Capital Solutions series being organised by Better Futures Australia. The session will be unpacking the ecosystem of players, showing the grassroots activities that are happening. Better Futures Australia would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the past, present and emerging elders of this nation. And I would particularly like to pay respect to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Better Futures Australia is running these seminars to highlight the key opportunities in building our natural capital so we can scale up our ambition on climate in the lead up to the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow next November. My name is 𝗘𝗰𝘆𝗶 Patterson and I'm the MD of Frontier Impact Group and 𝗘𝗫𝘂𝗶𝘁. And our business is focused on helping participate with the financing side of natural capital. And one of our goals is to play a role in helping see 500 million hectares of land be restored globally by 2030. In the first session of the Natural Capital webinar series, we learnt the importance of creating healthy landscapes. One area that I don't think is very well known is the impact our landscapes have on the water cycle. Plants are just so important because as they grow, they release energy that transfers into the atmosphere and cools the earth. So it plays a really important role. At the climate change conferences, it's been highlighted that land restoration solutions can solve at 30% of the climate crisis, which is quite extraordinary because we are very much focused on greenhouse gas emissions and reductions, but not so much focused on the carbon that we can draw down into the soil. I'd like to now introduce our first speaker. We've got amazing speakers today, all experts, all doing wonderful things on the ground. And it's the work on the ground that is important. It's probably the hardest part. How do we engage the community? How do we ensure that it gets mobilised on the ground? And we're very lucky to have the speakers that we have because each one of them are doing great things and they'll be sharing their experiences with you today. First of all, I'd like to welcome Brendan Foran. He's the CEO of Greening Australia, and I'm sure you've all heard of Greening Australia. Brendan himself, though, has been a pioneer since the early 2000s and leading Greening Australia since 2011. During that time, Brendan has been motivated to mobilise Greening Australia and to get them as an NGO to think bigger, to have a clear vision and to develop productive landscapes, which is what he's been doing. Most people are aware that Greening Australia is actually one of the largest developers of carbon projects in Australia, which is extraordinary for a not-for-profit. Would you please make welcome Brendan?
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for the acknowledgement to country, and hi to everyone out there. I hope you're doing well. It's nice to be with you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about a topic that I really enjoy talking about. And I think the questions that Better Futures Australia are asking are really timely and relevant questions. And I think we're seeing interest in this area that has more substance and momentum than we've seen for quite some time. So firstly, to the question that's been put to me around transformational collaboration, or how collaboration is transforming best practice, the way I'd probably like to start is by saying that language and definition of this concept of collaboration is really important, particularly with the way that I think about it. And what I see about collaboration and partnership, or how I see collaboration and partnership, is about the intersection of strategy, is where strategic objectives overlap. And that doesn't always mean that strategies intersect where you think they most obviously intersect. There are a couple of very, very obvious intersections of strategy in the sector that I work and the unique offering that we make into natural capital solutions here in Australia. And one would be the organisations that Kate represents, the NRM organisations in Australia, who we have a very natural collaboration with. Equally, I'm also the chair of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, which brings together 11 of the largest environmental on-ground organisations in the country, with combined revenues of about $500 million and about 500 employees, etc. And that's a really obvious collaboration. But a lot of the really transformational collaborations, in my view, are the less obvious ones, and the ones where you may ask yourself, why are they working together? One of our more high-profile ones over the last 12 months has been our partnership with Woodside Energy. And to me, at Greening Australia, and you can see this over my shoulder here, the enterprise that thinks bigger than the environment and believes that economies, communities, environment should be connected in ways that benefit them all. It's very obvious that why we would work with someone like Woodside. We have aspirations for 330,000 hectares of landscape restoration over the next 10 years, the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And Woodside have an aspiration to deliver sustainable carbon markets with co-benefits. When you bring our 40 years of technical know-how and IP together with an organisation that has the resource, the balance sheet to develop resource production at scale, that's that intersection of strategy that we're speaking about. In the first phase of our partnership with Woodside, we're contemplating 7,500 hectares, just out of 3 unique projects that we're doing with Woodside. That's just year 1. And to put that into context, we just signed off our year in review at our annual general meeting yesterday. 7,500 hectares with Woodside in the first 12 to 18 months. Last year, a 38-year-old organisation, its entire footprint for the year was 6,000 hectares. So that's just the pilot. So you can see that pathway to resource production at scale. Of course, that's backed by market-based instruments, and why market-based instruments are really important in my mind in terms of collaboration partnerships for our sector, for natural capital solutions is, and the scientists on the call will understand this, is that impact is measured through change in life condition or change in status. And often the instruments that we've put in place in the past, which we've called natural capital solutions, you can't do that in a 2 to 3 year time frame without the backing of accountable market-based approaches, which ensure that what you say you will deliver, you will deliver. So that's what we're working on with Woodside. Equally, public policy and the court of public opinion often tries to put organisations like mine into a different corner than an organisation like Wendy's at Farmers for Climate Action and the agricultural sector. Equally, the Forest Association and red meat, etc. Often we're seen to be pushed into different corners. It was about 12 months ago, or maybe a little bit longer, that we came together and launched an initiative called the 𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗏 Alliance. Now, all we did was launch a document with 4 or 5 key principles. Not really much else happened. There was a couple of serious discussions, but we were able to harness the attendance of both the Minister for Climate Change, the then Minister for Agriculture, and their shadow counterparties at a launch in Parliament House. They all happily appeared in photos. They all happily agreed with the intent and principles, because seemingly left and right issues were being brought into the middle ground, which is what was the opening comments from Jennifer around Better Futures Australia. That probably flows me on to the work that we've done with the Australian government. And I think it's probably fair to say that the longest and most successful collaboration that Greening Australia has been involved in since 1982 has been that with the Australian government. And that Greening Australia now in 2020, near enough to 40 years old, 150 staff, annual revenues of near enough to $40 million, and contracts going out several years now, as Jennifer said there before, through carbon credits and seed contracts, etc., with a very diversified funding base. Over 70% of our income comes from non-government sources. When I started back in 2011, about 91% was from government sources. I would say that's a very, very successful collaboration between the Australian government and Greening Australia. It's really easy to criticise the government. It really is, but you'd have to say that that is a great example of a successful collaboration that's transformed practice. However, you get to certain stages in relationships where you want something different. And we're not breaking up with the government. We've changed, and we're asking them to change as well, to this next question. We're actually asking the government to play a different role in the environment. And earlier this year, I was involved in a meeting with the Federal Environment Minister, and I've had subsequent conversations, and I'm on record as saying this, and I absolutely recognise the role of volunteers and grants in the sector that I work in. They will always play a role. They will always play a role, and it's an important role. But we can't expect volunteers and grants-based approaches to meet the challenges of the 21st century. So what we're saying to our partners in government, our collaborators in government, to the question that we've been asked in the panel here today is, I see a different role for you. I see a role for you as a cornerstone investor. I see a role for you as a market maker. And I see a role for you as removing the barriers to real scale in this country. And I guess that gets to the core belief of how I think we harness natural capital solutions is, and again, it's over my shoulder here, which, we solve challenges in which nature, communities, and economies are connected in ways that benefit them all, is we inherently believe that it doesn't have to be a left or right issue. And so when we sit down with government these days, we are bringing what we believe is valuable assets to the table, significant skin to the table. And we're saying to the government, we're not asking you to give us the money, we're asking you to work with us. We can bring the money, but this is the role that we need you to play. We need different methodologies. We need better incentives for landholders. We need landholders to be rewarded for ecosystem services, because the landholders we're working for want to see carbon markets, seed production services, all the other benefits that flow from their land, the benefits largely which accrue off their land. We want them to be rewarded for that, and they want to integrate these types of initiatives into their on-farm enterprise. They say to us that it helps smooth out the volatility in their production cycle, but they see themselves as a more holistic enterprise these days rather than just producing an annual P&L. So that's again is talking about that a different approach and bringing different collaborators together. The mindset behind seeing government as a cornerstone investor and also as an infrastructure player in the environment across any sector does not deprioritise that grants-based approach from my point of view, though. And I do, as I said there before, I still think it's incredibly important because a lot of innovation comes from volunteers, a lot of innovation comes from grants. We just want to make sure that we have the right tools for the job. And I think volunteers and grants can't stimulate natural capital solutions at scale. However, it can stimulate innovation that drives scale, et cetera. So I just want to make sure that differentiation is really clear. Now I'll talk a little bit about the not-for-profit sector from my perspective. I'm conscious of time. It's not only about what the government needs to do. I want to talk about what my sector needs to do. And I've been in 3 continents now where I've heard the statement, and I've adopted it, that there's no shortage of capital, there's a shortage of deals. My sector needs to improve, and I won't talk about everyone else, I'll talk about the responsibility my organisation accepts, is if we are asking, well, we can't always be saying this problem is money. It's not always the problem. Sometimes the problem is actually ensuring that you can actually produce the outcomes that that money is seeking. And I think our sector needs to get, Greening Australia is improving and needs to get better at actually setting targets, achieving those targets, and building a track record of accountability, governance, and delivery against sources of capital that expect outcomes. Again, going back to my comment there before, that's really important for impact. 25 years of investment into a landscape is fantastic for creating real change, but we have to deliver what we say we're going to deliver. The keys to this, in my mind, is embracing the tools that other sectors use around technology, data, innovation, and high levels of accountability and frameworks which actually enhance performance, efficiency. I don't allow people in my organisation to say when the carbon price hits $40, we're in town. I say we need to get our transaction cost down to the price point in the market so that our premium product is the carbon product of choice to compliance buyers. We all know what the behaviour of CFOs and audit committees are, which is show me where we're compliant, now talk about the cost, then tell me about the animals. I'll hear about that after I know that we've discharged our obligations. So we're trying to flip the equation that it's always about the money, and we're saying it's actually about the deal structure and all the things that come with that. Now, communities, in my mind, are the natural beneficiaries of natural capital solutions. I don't think it's fair to say that it's the role of government to constantly subsidise regional prosperity. But these tools that we're talking about, natural capital solutions, do have win-win-wins for the communities. And in this last 12 months alone, in my organisation, we've employed 42 new people. And that has been through harnessing natural capital solutions, taking them out into regional communities. And every dollar that goes into restoration actually delivers a multiplier effect of about $5, starting from seed going all the way through. So it's about having a conversation with communities around natural capital solutions where we're talking about economies, communities and the benefits, talking about trees but not mentioning the word trees. That's what we think about. So that's the end of the story, and it's a great outcome, but we're talking about the benefits that come to economies and communities in language that they understand. In language they understand, employment, educated people moving back into communities, regional investment, improving agricultural productivity, improving water quality downstream, etc. So those benefits are really well understood, but we do talk in Greening Australia about making sure that the benefits that flow are talked about in that broad prism of economies, communities, environments being connected all together. Very conscious of time, Jennifer, I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that. Pretty impressive. You sound more like an investment banker than an NGO, Brendan. But you know, that's what we need. This is the scale up, and I think what you have developed at Greening Australia is quite incredible. Because in order for us to achieve that 500 million hectares of land rehabilitation by 2030, and during the last session, we were talking about how much land Australia needs to contribute. And we're talking about probably 80 million hectares is probably fair. And that's a lot of hectares. But what I'm excited about listening to your story is, you know, you must be one of the leading NGOs worldwide in terms of what you've achieved as an organisation. And I think it's really important that, you know, you're continuing to be ambitious and continuing to scale up, because 80 million is a lot. And how many of that 80 million, Brendan, do you think you can achieve? What are your plans by 2030?
Yeah, so so there's 90 million hectares of land that's been cleared in Australia since European settlements. So that deficit is about, you know, we're talking about 10 million hectares difference there. Our current target's 330,000 hectares with a window to replicate that out to 1 million hectares through 2 different approaches. So it sounds like a small amount, 1 million of 80 million hectares, but one of the strategies that we're employing is it's no good if there's only one organisation that's capable of doing 1 million hectares or 330,000 hectares, depending on which approach we ultimately resource. So we're thinking about how we create IP, open source IP, through data that's loaded into platforms. And with people participating through those platforms, that IP, which has largely been supported by the Australian government up until this stage, could be a conduit for working in those NRM regions. Okay, 56 of them around the country. So we're thinking about, we can't do it all by ourselves, but we are a leading restoration organisation. For us to do 80 million hectares, we would be, wow, we would be bigger than BHP. That's just too much risk for a single organisation. It's probably not the most effective and efficient way. So without revealing all the details here, we are thinking about how we can create some sort of replication effect through those tools of technology, innovation, data management, with a clear assumption that we actually make natural capital solutions work as an investment, as an investment priority for people with access to capital.
That sounds really important in connecting the work that needs to be done on the ground in the capital. And it's great that you've been able to achieve that, because there are a lot of groups that are still being challenged by that. What I'll do, I'll leave the rest of the questions to the Q&A. What I'd like to do now is invite Louise Edmonds. Louise lives in Western Australia. She's had a passion for compost and soil since the early 2000s. She started 𝗘𝗏𝘆𝘀𝘆𝘀𝘁𝗲𝗺 to help transition farmers to build the carbon in their soil, and has plans to transform the wheat belt. Now, given her resilience and what I know about Louise, I would bet that she can make that happen. And we're counting on her, because that's an important part of that 80 million hectares that we need to restore. I'd like to welcome Louise.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer, and really wonderful to hear from you, Brendan. Part of me feels like I could have said almost exactly the same things. So I work exclusively in the soil carbon sequestration method, and anyone who knows these methods knows that the soil method is a bit challenging. You know, in my experience, we've got a huge deal, a very compelling investment opportunity for investors. There's plenty of investors out there, but they're missing some courage. And I think, you know, what you're saying, Brendan, there, from the perspective of governments being a cornerstone investor in these kinds of things, I think you're absolutely on the money in that regard, particularly in a method like soil, which really hasn't been commercialised yet. And I feel I'm really up against, you know, up against that challenge in our attempt to raise money. So just to get a sense of the projects that we are running, we work in the wheat belt and in the grazing regions of the southwest of Western Australia. Our intention is to launch on about 260,000 hectares in those regions. We are a carbon farming project developer. We're also a private agricultural extension agency. If the rest of the country is anything like Western Australia, much of the extension work that was previously performed by state-sponsored extension agents no longer exists in Western Australia. So we believe that there's an enormous gap in the market in terms of bringing the latest knowledge in science, which is moving incredibly fast, and management to farmers. So we're filling that gap as a core component of our activities. We're also a carbon credit aggregator and marketer. So our focus is very much on outcomes in the same way that you've expressed that, I believe, Brendan. And we've got some very sophisticated tools that we intend to deploy to actually demonstrate those outcomes above and beyond the requirements of the carbon market. So we are also doing, you know, enterprise level and landscape scale natural capital accounting. We're also a savoury hub. I noticed that Tony Hill's on the call here, the leader of the savoury hub on the East Coast. And we will be utilising the Savoury Institute's ecological outcome verification protocol as both a monitoring tool and a tool to support farmers in their management. So yeah, our focus for farmers is really to provide them with all of the tools that they need to successfully execute on those management actions that achieve the carbon sequestration outcomes, to support them to prove it through the various tools that we have, and also to help them get rewarded. And there are three key areas where we feel that they can be rewarded. And the first is really in the productivity and profitability of the underlying farming enterprise. And I think that that's very important, that is always the focus of our work. The benefits through the sale of carbon is a bonus, but we also see huge potential in respect to markets and gaining access to premium prices through branding, particularly at the scale that we're operating at. So we're very excited about that as well. Yeah, so we're very close to getting into the market and deploying our projects, and really thrilled to have been given the opportunity to speak to you today, and thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction.
Wonderful. And just wondering, what do you find, is soil carbon a lot more challenging to get that investment than actual regeneration of vegetation or planting of trees? Is it because it is new and people can't get their head around it, Louise? And what do you see the economic opportunity for moving down that path?
The economic opportunity is enormous. I believe that the opportunities in soil carbon enable us to scale very rapidly. From my observations in Western Australia, the vegetation methods have some constraints to scale, which is access to land. So it's, in some circumstances in our environment, the yield from trees does not justify the change in land use. whereas the activities of soil carbon are in addition to the production of food and fibre. And also politically, you know, there's some reluctance to change land use to disrupt the production of food and fibre, and that can become politically quite sensitive. So the opportunity is enormous, but the soil method does not have the history that the vegetation methods have. So, for example, I was working in vegetation plantings way back in 2006 in the voluntary markets with a company called 𝗘𝗰𝘀𝘀𝘆𝘀𝘀𝗆, who you would probably all be familiar with. So, you know, even at that time, we were struggling to get access to land. But as I said, you know, a lot of the methods are modelled, and many of the methods, including the industrial methods, you know, have a history of data behind them, and soil doesn't have that. And I think that another element of soil is the complexity around the social and ecological context in which we're working in. And I think that's quite difficult for investors to get their head around, that what we're really talking about is a deep cultural change in the way that we practice agriculture, and that takes time. And so for that reason, you know, the carbon sink programs are designed to actually support the farmers for an entire 25 years. You know, we see this as something that, a change that must occur, but will require persistent, dedicated effort over a generation to have those shifts really embed into the communities and the environment.
That's, yeah. No, I agree with that. And with the federal government, do you think the technology roadmap and the support around soil carbon as a priority, do you think that will be helpful with what you're doing, Louise?
Well, it's great to see it on the agenda, and it's great to see the minister speaking so eloquently about the photosynthetic pathway to soil carbon sequestration. You know, it's almost like, oh my God, a politician said it, so it must be real, or the television said it, so it must be possible. So that's great for me. I'm just sitting back and waiting to see how they deploy that. So yeah, I'm hopeful, but I'm not holding my breath.
Okay, I'm sure you're going to make it happen regardless, Louise, knowing you. Now, I would like to now introduce you to another amazing person, Wendy Cohen, CEO at the Farmers for Climate Action. Wendy is playing a very important grassroots role in Australia, and part of that, I think, that's really important is her background in having grown up in small townships across rural New South Wales, where she saw the challenges and rewards of farming, which were part of everyday life, but cannot obviously see what can be done to actually improve and restore our land. And working for Farmers for Climate Action, she has the ability to utilise that knowledge in order to make a really big difference. I'd like to introduce you to Wendy Cohen.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thanks all for your interest in Farmers for Climate Action. Before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge the owners of the land from where I'm coming from in very hot and humid Canberra. Can you believe it? The 𝗛𝗏𝗏 people, and pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. I am going to share my screen with you because I have some images that are probably a little bit more interesting than and this way I can take you through a little bit of I guess the journey and the story of Farmers for Climate Action, and demonstrate through this story, I guess, the way that we can uniquely contribute to a collaborative model. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Great, fantastic. Okay, so before I kick off about Farmers for Climate Action, I think in just speaking to Lisa previously, one of the important end goals for this particular forum is normalising climate action. And to that, I would have to suggest that farmers probably represent the most natural way that Australia more broadly can really understand how we normalise climate action and appreciate why it's so important. Farmers are, you know, incredibly pragmatic. They're traditionally conservative. They inhabit that middle ground that I think the climate movement in particular really needs to elevate the conversation and engage with our political leaders, particularly the LNP. Also, farmers, as you know, are an incredibly trusted voice. They are solutions focused, and a lot of what climate action needs in terms of on-farm practices, farmers are already doing right now. And so it is a brilliant way really to tell the story of how we can normalise climate action. And we'll hear a little bit about some of the things that our farmers are doing and what FCA has been able to achieve recently in a little bit. But I think it's important also when thinking about collaboration, it's talking about challenges that obviously we can tackle together, and where there might be alignment, natural overlap in terms of the vision that organisations such as the ones that are appearing now can offer, so that we can all, you know, basically pull together and share our sweet spots to progress a unified position and purpose, but still stay true to our character and our brand, if you like. The most important thing I think to start off with is positioning and getting a common understanding of how important farming is. So it would be arguably one of the most iconic industries in the country. And to that end, we are uniquely placed to lead the way and make sure that we have a low emissions, a low carbon future for our country. Farming is crucial, and agriculture is crucial to the discussion and the solutions. We know that farming, a couple of stats for us all, we know that farming represents 58% of Australia's land managed by agricultural businesses. Farmers are the stewards of a great deal of the country's land. There are 85 farming businesses nationwide employing over 250,000 people. And agriculture, in terms of the NFF's vision, is on track to being a $100 billion industry by 2030. Agriculture, forestry and other land contributes to 13% of Australia's greenhouse emissions. So we have skin in the game. We're part of the problem, so we need to be definitely leading the solutions. Farmers and rural regional Australians feel the impact of climate change most dramatically. We're at the coalface. And it's crucial that all of Australians understand that, because farming feeds and clothes us all, that our perspectives and our experience and our solutions and the future of sustainable farming communities in Australia are front and centre in terms of the recovery through COVID, but also tackling climate change. We all know, I don't need to be a doomsday teller, but we all know the current state of play. It's quite dire, but I also think that coming out of the situation are some incredible opportunities right now. And just recently, of course, the National Farmers Federation has endorsed the net zero 2050 targets economy-wide. That was something that actually Farmers for Climate Action was really thoroughly involved with from the very beginning. We're an associate member of NFF, and we were really had a seat around the table from the very beginning, when the National Farmers Federation was really dragging its feet in terms of climate policy and committing to any sort of targets. But most recently, I think it was August, at the Members' Council meeting, the climate policy was endorsed. And it was, you know, quite amazing to see actually that the majority of the members, the commodity groups and the farming federations, were actually wanting the net zero 2050 target to be much more ambitious. And it's really pleasing. It's really a great example of the incredible shift in the last few years in terms of middle Australia, conservative Australia, rural and regional Australia really understanding imperative to dial up our ambition in terms of the net zero targets. Farmers for Climate Action is uniquely positioned to do what's needed. We are an advocacy body primarily. We have a theory of change that if we organise farmers to lead climate solutions on farm and advocate together, we can influence our sector and the government to implement climate policies that reduce pollution and benefit rural communities. And being true to that theory of change, and with a relatively small organisation, we've actually been able to deliver quite a number of milestones and wins in the last 18 months or so. AgMin supported the development of a national climate change and agricultural work plan, the National Farmers Federation's climate policy, as I just mentioned. We were able in May, I think, Pete, May or June, launching Regional Horizons, which effectively was our stimulus ask initially, but has now really become a cornerstone piece, an agenda piece for our strategy going forward. Soon after, the federal government actually announced their 8 drought resilience, adoption and innovation hubs, which closely resemble a key component of the Regional Horizons document. And we have been able to build our network of farmers of more than 5,000. Not only are they great ambassadors and advocates for climate action, but they're climate literate. And I think that's a really important part. Before I talk about Regional Horizons a little bit more, I just wanted to mention something that's really important that we always consider in terms of our stakeholder engagement, our farmers, our delivery of climate literacy programs, and in terms of Regional Horizons, the creation of knowledge hubs, resilience hubs. And that is that Farmers for Climate Action is incredibly inclusive, and we facilitate change through inclusion, not division. And to that end, we are really a broad church in terms of all sorts of farming methodologies and philosophies and practices. And I think it's really important to understand that, because it's really key when forming partnerships and alliances and aligning with partners, that we understand our approach and our philosophies around the practices that we represent. Regional Horizons, you may be familiar with. It's something that we're really proud of, and we've been representing Regional Horizons to all of our stakeholders, our donors, our supporters, of course, our farmers, and introducing it to MPs so that we can really continue to encourage them to take leadership in terms of climate policy. One of the cornerstone areas is, of course, the works plan, which AgMin has endorsed, and we're really continuing to seek engagement with MPs to get the government really to implement that and to drive that home. I think that's going to really create clarity and really make sure that transformation can exist. Our collaboration model is quite unique in the sense that we have extraordinary board. We have advisors from leading climate and agricultural researchers. We have a staff which has a real diversity of expertise and interests and capacities that span politics, advocacy, regional development, media and marketing. And our collaborators, as you can see, are the most highly regarded in this space. And it's our unique community grassroots model where we elevate farmers' experience and solutions, needs, and their desire for sustainability, which really sets us apart. And I think we can pull through the experience of farmers and elevate that to the broader public, to industry, to academics and researchers, and importantly to politicians. So that's I guess what uniquely we bring to the table is that quite intimate and very engaged model with the community. And I think that brings a really exciting layer of understanding, experience, and efforts and knowledge in design of programs and collaboration models going forward that our partners and collaborators to date have found that has been incredibly useful. And finally, I think we'll be touching on the Q&A in terms of what government can do more. And one of our policy advisors has coined a fabulous saying, which is saying that, you know, the farmers are doing their best to manage the unavoidable, but the government needs to act to avoid the unmanageable impacts of runaway warming. And so I'm happy to sort of leave you with that, and also let you know that I'm really happy to chat with you about the work of Farmers for Climate Action, but also our wonderful Peter Holding, who's our farmer outreach manager, is also here, and he's a really experienced farmer and will have some fantastic insights, I'm sure. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Wendy. And what a fantastic role you're playing in terms of facilitating change. And that is a really difficult part of the transition. And it sounds like you're really collaborating with a lot of the best knowledge in the sector, which is great. And I love the regional horizons. I think they're really an important component. One thing I'm quite interested in is whether with the experiences of COVID, like in the city, we talk a lot about the impact it's had to the city, but what impact has that had to farmers? And do you think energy security is now seen as a high priority and that might help with the transition?
Oh, I think energy security is a huge issue, but always has been. And food security, of course, also is a serious priority for farmers and farming communities and supply chain and everyday Australians. But with COVID, I think you've seen quite a magnificent response, in fact, from farming communities in rural and regional Australia. But more and more, particularly now, just to get back to your original question around the energy, I think with the renewables roadmap announced by Matt Keane, for example, we're getting some real oomph behind this need to provide strong pathways into a renewables future. All the while managing that hot potato, which is the gas-led recovery announced by the feds. You know, we've got our own thoughts around that. But farming communities, it's suffice to say, are torn. You know, we really do represent, you know, that we know of, a strong cohort of 5,000 farmers, but there are tens of thousands of more farmers out there that we need to engage with, and we need to talk with and bust some myths around moving away from gas and fossil fuels in general. We need to bust some myths around what jobs exist in a renewables future and what that means to rural and regional Australia and farming communities. And there's a lot of work around engagement and advocacy that needs to happen. Long-winded answer, Jennifer, but I hope that sort of addresses a little bit.
That was great. And what would be your ask of government, Wendy? Because agriculture is such an important backbone of Australia. And what do you think would help farmers the most that could be introduced?
Some leadership and some surety around what the future looks like, so that farmers can continue to manage their businesses and their farms with the full knowledge, you know, that they bring in a sustainable way, which is, you know, tapping into sustainability, better land care management, trade, carbon neutrality, and you know, more evolved carbon market, an array of policy levers that need to be pulled to provide some surety for farming communities, but also for investment and insurance and superannuation, so that we can have a really holistic approach to building a framework for you know, a low emissions future for the whole country, but particularly farming communities. But there are lots of practical, smaller detail components to that response. I probably need 2 hours to do But I'd like to think that one of the things that we're really focused on right now is continuing to work with the ministers that get it, the politicians that get it, and look at you know, renewables future and how farming can embrace renewables, either on farm as a way to reduce their own emissions and meet you know, carbon neutrality demands for their product, or how they can diversify their businesses and have wind turbines on their farms that can tap into a really evolved and well-developed transmission grid, so that, you know, they can, you know, create more income sustainably, give their employees jobs managing turbines instead of, you know, continuing just to focus on one area of farming. I think that's really exciting space, but there's a plethora of other ways that we'd love to see the government help. The resilience hubs really excite us, I have to say. We're really happy that Minister Littleproud has announced those. But yeah, there's hopefully we can tease out some more in the Q&As.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing. We have now our last speaker, Dr. Kate Andrews. For several decades, it makes you sound really old, Kate, when I don't think you are. You've been in a wide variety of roles across Australia in natural resource management, environment and agriculture, and particularly in the rangelands and Northern Australia. Currently, Kate is CEO for NRM Regions, the collective body for Australia's 54 regional RM organisations. Kate is going to share with us the important work that NRM is undertaking. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone else, because I feel like you've done my job for me. So I'll just try and pick out some of the best bits. And I think there's just one point that I feel we haven't made or emphasised, but you've all made my points, and very eloquently. And Wendy, I wanted to say that line that you put up from whoever it was that wrote it about the government's role to avoid the unmanageable is fantastic. It sums up a lot very quickly. So thank you. I also wanted to thank Brendan for his discussion about collaborative platforms and a number of other things that I'll touch upon. But look, I wanted to start off quickly by saying sometimes I think we can talk about these things as if we're starting from scratch, or as if it's new, and we don't always acknowledge or recognise the amazing history that we have and we've been a part of in Australia. And particularly in what we now call natural capital, which in the past we use the terminology, you know, land use management or whatever. And look, some of those examples go way back. So one of them I think is really under-recognised is soil conservation, and the soil conservation movement that started a long time ago and was being acknowledged 2 centuries ago in Australia, believe it or not, with the changed land use practices that were introduced. But really that movement took off in the 1950s, and we have that movement to thank for a lot of the work that we now do in catchments and on our soils. So the soil conservation movement was a great example of natural capital solutions work. It really did turn around erosion and salinity in a lot of areas of Australia, and we take that for granted now. But then we had the land care movement in the 70s. And that was a great example of just what Brendan was talking about, where you brought together supposedly warring parties to collaborate, and Wendy's given us examples of this too, to collaborate and actually get the government to pay attention to something. And by doing that, through that collaboration, really making a huge difference. And through that, generating small-scale collaborations right across the country. And then another one, which I think is, you know, a grand experiment on a continental scale that we underestimate too, is actually the regional natural resource management groups. And the fact that, look, we had versions of them across the country, in certain parts of the country as integrated catchment management, or, you know, different names. But in the early 2000s, the Australian government decided to actually establish the continent-wide network of regional natural resource management organisations, understanding that we needed to be doing collaboration and we needed to be working with people who manage the land, but in the landscape. You couldn't do that from Canberra, or you couldn't even do that from Brisbane or Sydney. You had to actually be based in the landscape. So that to me, that for me is 3 examples of the foundation that's been created in Australia, I think, for collaboration and natural capital, and we're building upon that work. The other thing about that too is I think those examples bring together across sectors, though they don't bring as much of the private sector to the table as I think we're now finding with carbon and some of the natural capital solutions. So I think we've got a real innovation in the system happening there with how we bring the private sector more clearly to the table. And really exciting to hear Brendan's story about the transition of greening Australia from being so dependent upon public funds to diversifying in that way, but also the diversification that's happening on farm as well. And this understanding that we can move to being, you know, multiple use or multifunctional landscapes, it's the terminology that they actually use in academia. So the other thing I wanted to just do a shout out to is the practitioners, research, policymakers type of collaboration that we're also building upon, that has existed for a really, really long time. More recently, I think one of the things that I also wanted to point out that when I look back is one of the things I think we've really improved in, and I think this is something where the savanna burning methodology and others are fabulous examples of this in carbon farming, is where we are now collaborating more explicitly and on better terms with our first Australians and with Indigenous Australia. And I think that's something we used to do very, very badly. And we've made so much progress in the last 20 years, still a long way to go, but all of our organisations and all of the people you have on this panel are acknowledging the work that needs to happen there, and also the great collaborations that exist. So thank you to Brendan also for highlighting that. But it's something that I'm quite proud of, with the progress that natural resource management regional bodies have made too across the country in the way we partner with people. And it's true partnership and collaboration where you are actually sharing that power. So look, that's another thing where I think the natural capital solutions journey and carbon farming has actually really helped that, because I remember, you know, in the territory, it was the Western Arnhem Land fire abatement scheme that had the best arrangement with the private sector that came out of the blue and surprised a whole lot of, you know, quite conservative traditional NRM organisations by just totally leading the pack. So that to me is a really important recognition we need to make. Okay, as far as the role of government, which I've been asked to talk about too, I did want to just pick out some of the points that have already been made and highlight them, because I think they're really important. And I think sometimes we can drop into this idea that really the only thing the government does is resource stuff, you know, fund stuff. It hands over the grant programs and that's it. And that really, as our speakers have said, just totally underdoes the importance of the government role in providing for natural capital solutions work, and also in the collaborations that we have with them. And one of them that I was really pleased Wendy brought up was the leadership and national aspirations. And I just think, you know, we can be crying out for that, that leadership and that aspiration, a bit like the $100 billion that was put forward by the NFF, which is an aspiration which we may not achieve, but gee, once we're motivated by that, we figure out how we can get there. So we really do need that from particularly from federal government. And then of course there's a whole lot of other roles that they play through legislation and policy, etc. But one of the things I like to think about is what can the government do that we can't do, the private sector can't do, or non-government organisations or landholders. And I think there's a few roles there. One of them is the scale, the continent-wide element. Some of it is the continuity, and the fact that they can put the conditions into place that help provide that continuity, and also that coherence. So you can hear private sector when they cry out for signals to the market that will provide some continuity and some coherence. But also they can help create those enabling frameworks that all of our speakers have talked about, whether it's Louise talking about, you know, soil methodologies, or Wendy talking about it in relation to renewable energy. There are enabling frameworks that we really do need the public sector to be helping us create in order to be able to transition to or cooperate with the private sector and with markets. So a market doesn't just appear out of the blue. And a wonderful example of this is in fact the carbon farming legislation and the emissions reduction fund. And the work that's gone on behind the scenes to create a robust marketplace, but that work's being done by the public sector. And I think we really sometimes underestimate that wonderful hybrid space that's created between the public and private, and which all of the speakers have talked about. So that to me is something that is really important that we do need from government. And when you start talking about it, it can sound really not very interesting, but it's really important for providing, you know, integrity of those systems, and also for trying to deal with the market failures. Because some of what we're trying to pick up here, some of the problems we're trying to solve, let's be honest, have been created by market failure, as well as by failure of, you know, government policy. So how do we then figure out collaborations across those sectors that then deal with that and deal with the issues of the externalities or the long-term nature of things, or, you know, inequality or participation in market, those sorts of things. So that's something that I think we really need to be conscious of, and that we need to seek also from government, and to bring government to play. Another thing that really I just wanted to tag to, which is great to hear coming from some of the speakers, was this issue of innovation and creating, you know, the right circumstances, as well as some investment in innovation and technology. But around that, you need the governance, not government, but the governance structures for that to work, and the right incentives for that. And so Brendan talking about collaborative platforms and how you bring things together, I think is fabulous, and very much, I think, look, all of us are on the same page here. So it would be fantastic for us all to be able to leverage across each other and make these work better. And I think there's some really good examples about what government is doing at the federal level. Some of that is on the data space. So, you know, continent-wide provision of the best possible data and information, and the so what. Why is that information relevant to us? So climate projections, climate data, you know, climate modelling, and making sure that's available to farmers and to regional bodies and to all sorts of other organisations and to the private sector. So there are all these things that government is investing in: national environmental economic accounts, farm stewardship schemes, and hopefully a framework for that. A way of putting into place those frameworks and enabling people without actually getting in the way, I think is really, really important. Look, the one last thing I did actually want to say too, because I could, like the others, get over enthusiastic about all of these different topics, and I'm going to have forgotten a whole lot of points that I want to make. But look, there is one principle that I do want to highlight that I think we've only just touched upon. And that is that when we're talking about natural capital solutions and we're talking about the environment that we're in, we can't forget that this is place-based, and that landscape and connectivity across landscape becomes really important. So that if you are doing an action on the ground on a farm or at the top of a catchment or whatever it might be, that can have an impact elsewhere. And one of the things that we were really pleased with the carbon farming legislation was that there was an acknowledgement of regional natural resource management plans to try and ensure that we didn't have perverse outcomes or activities working at cross purposes or creating more problems. So for me, there really does need to be also a spatial recognition and a spatial coherence at a relevant scale, so that we make sure we're not making problems worse, or we're not making new problems, or we're not, for example, taking away conservation values by doing carbon plantings, or taking away surface runoff for farmers by doing, you know, there's all this work that you'll all be really familiar with, but that has to be put, and that has to be linked in some way. And I believe linking across silos and linking across actions in the landscape is really, really important. And I think that's something that landscape scale planning is really important for. And for me, regional NRM plans are a really key way of doing that, but I'm sure other people see other things. But we do have those plans across the continent. I think we need to be using them better. I think we need to be making them better. And to me, they are fundamentally collaborative. So those plans are a great example of collaborating with all of those people who are out there doing good stuff on country, whether they're growing crops, food and fibre, or whether they're managing Indigenous lands and waters, or whether they're people like Greening Australia who are out there saying we have to improve and regenerate. How we're going to do that, and doing it through their re-veg programs, or whether it is the private sector and banking investors. We are all trying to do this, but we need to be able to link and do this in a coherent way that maximizes our positive outcomes and those multiple benefits. So that to me is my little plug at the end of saying thank you to all the speakers for actually covering off on lots of really great points.
That is fantastic. You've even got me motivated to go and look at those NRM plans now, Kate. I want to be able to see your vision, and I want to see, because that's really, that you're really right around being able to look at this in a spatial way. It's the systems thinking. And I think, you know, over time, we have got a bit lazy because we've been in a country that's always produced beautiful food, and there have been a lot of opportunities, but now we've got a lot more challenges. And now we need to think, you know, more broadly than I think we used to. So the NRM plans are an important part of that. And as Brendan spoke about, you know, the decision platforms, the platforms and the tools that are needed is an important part of that. And the regional hubs that Wendy discussed in order to, you know, be the link between these out in the communities. And then the service providers like Louise, who can connect with the farmers and guide them, I think is really important as well. So, so thank you for sharing that. Can you give me an example of where you have seen, it would be good to have an example of where you think that a systems approach hasn't been adopted, just to illustrate to people that are on this call of some of the perverse things that can happen, Kate.
Okay. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I also think doing systems work is really, really hard. And so sometimes we'll find with regional NRM plans, we manage to move towards that. And then there might be things that push us away from that. So yes, I will jump in and say that. But I should also, I just really want to emphasize that point about the climate change and conditions we're working in. The other thing about this is also that coherence over time. So the fact that we have to know that we're not making a decision for conditions now, but that in a planning process, we're making decisions, even if it's a carbon planting or whatever it is, that we're making decisions for what the climate is going to look like down the track. So we also have to have mechanisms, and this is what Brendan was talking about as well. You have to have mechanisms for being able to link to that knowledge and understanding, and to have that inform your planning and your action. Whether you're a farmer or whether you're Greening Australia putting an enormous planning out there or whatever, you really need to be able to do that. And that's one thing that also the government can help invest in, so that we have access to those things, and that can be bedded into plans. So look, there's some really obvious ones where people, for example, water is always used as a way of showing the connectivity across the landscape, and it's a really easy one to understand. But I'm not going to use a water one. I'm going to use one where you have an area that is not being managed actively for fire and not being actively managed for weeds. And the fact that that area can then end up, if you don't have a spatial or a systems method, that area can end up being a real problem for other parts of that landscape. That area can end up, and lots of people will be familiar with examples of this, being a fire risk in sorts of ways. And by the way, I'm talking about appropriate fire management, cultural burning, not hazard reduction, in its simplistic form, or it can end up generating a weed load or a feral animal load for others. So there's also this understanding that we need to be actively managing country in a really appropriate way for it to be able to be a healthy landscape. It's not just a case of leaving things alone anymore. So for me, you can end up generating more weeds in the landscape, or you can end up increasing fire risk, or you can end up decreasing water if people need it, depending on how you manage your catchment or your landscape.
Thank you for that. I think that explained it beautifully. What I'd like to do now is call all the speakers up, and we're going to go to the Q&A session. I've really enjoyed that, and I think there's a few questions that people want to ask. But to start with, maybe to Brendan. Brendan, the systems approach that Kate was talking about, you know, how do we get there, and how do we get people to I think, adopt the NRM plans, I suppose, because obviously there's a lot of work that's being done there, and they are thinking about these system approaches. How do we connect better with the NRM plans, do you think?
Well, the most obvious answer to that is Greening Australia can't do its work out without the NRM plans.
Yeah.
You know, all those trees that we planted last year, all those gullies that we fixed on the reef catchments, the spatial planning that we're doing over our next, 15 years of carbon plantings are all informed by the NRM plans. And I think the NRM plans are not, it's easy to think, again, it's not like not thinking about the government as a collaborator and a partner. These are investments, and these are investments that inform natural capital solutions. And Kate, I think, answered it before by saying something like, they need to be regularly updated, they need to be refreshed, but understand that they really do take into account that local perspective of, what's happening on the ground. And I'll look over I'm so bad at this, over my shoulder that is one of our project officers with a number 2 elder from an Indigenous community up in the 𝗘𝗃𝗏. And I show this photo all the time because LinkedIn and management consultants, no offense to anyone that's written a report on LinkedIn or a management consultant, they'll always say the most important relationship in an organisation is that between the CEO and the chair. And I rubbish that idea and say that's the most important relationship in our organisation, because I can come with all the money in the world and all the execution plans in the world, but without that NRM plan and that project officer and that landholder, we're not going to get anything done. I don't know if I'm quite answering your question, but they are absolutely essential. And as we go through different updates of the National Land Care Project, et cetera, the one thing I would say is we have to see these NRM plans as an investment in Australia's infrastructure. They are an investment, and they people talk about top down, bottom up. They're actually both. So I think they're absolutely vital enablers, and they fit into this cornerstone investment, removing the barriers. There's not a single organisation, academic, private organisation in Australia that would do that work themselves. But that is a natural space the government needs to occupy. I'm sure Kate had this question 1,000 times, probably more. Do you think we've got too many NRMs? How many do you think we should have? I always answer it by saying, no, don't worry about that question. Focus on what they need to do and make sure they're doing that really well. And the NRM plans are the number one for me. They're also very much are boots on the ground and working with local land. So the NRM plans is just an output of all the other things they do as well, which again, there's no other institution in the country would do that off their own pat. So it's just so important that stuff exists for everything that we've talked about today. Implicit in my conversation, making it explicit now, is those things have to exist. Without them, we're rudderless.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. One of the questions that's asked is about Steggall's bill before Parliament, and they're looking for submissions. And one of the suggestions is, what about a new commission on top of all the bodies that are already in this space? Do you think that is a good suggestion? That was just a suggestion from the audience.
Is that to me?
Yeah. Sorry, Brendan. Yeah, to you.
Sorry. Look, it's possible that other people on the call are better than me to answer that. I haven't read the bill. I have people in my organisation, I'm fortunate enough now, that read that and tell me what we think about it. But I will say this is, commissions with mandates and independence are very important. And I'm always looking for the pathway to a common ground that most of the people can accept. And I think we've heard 1, 2, 3, 4 speakers after me who are talking about that. And I don't like seeing commission, I don't like seeing proposals which tie people up in bureaucratic processes and they don't have a clear mandate and they can't execute against their recommendations. So I know I'm not answering your question, but I have a very strong view of the role of independence and skills-based independence but science and commercial or economic based, whatever a commission is intended to look at, skills based commissions as well. So totally recognise I'm not totally answering the question, but my view is probably captured in a broad sense there.
Beautiful. Does anyone else have a view on the panel that would like to make any comments?
Yeah, I could add my 2 cents worth in. When 𝗖𝗽𝗆𝗀𝘀𝘁𝗆𝗿 launched the bill in end of February, beginning of March, I want to say, we were there at the launch at Parliament House with her. Having read the bill, I know that an independent commission is a cornerstone element of the bill. And the only other thing I wanted to say from our point of view, and certainly we support it, of course, it's you know, incredibly necessary, and getting crossbench support for such a significant piece of policy is you know, quite an amazing achievement. We would love to see rural and regional Australia feature more in it, and I think we need to ensure that the end audiences of this bill appreciate that it is not an inner city independent or Green member who's kind of coming up with the future plan for climate policy on behalf of rural and regional Australia. So yeah, I think it's a great step forward, but I think it probably needs to have a little bit more detail to support farming communities in particular, from my seat, obviously, vested interests, but yeah.
Thank you for that. One of the areas that sometimes, and Wendy, over to you again. It's funny because I can see you on my screen, so I'm basically talking to you. So I think people know that I'm talking to them, but I've worked out it doesn't work like that. But with regards to regenerative practices, like there's so many different farming practices, and there's a lot of people that feel what they do is the best. Yeah. Do you think that as part of, you know, having a body or something, that having a minimum standards group or something that could perhaps connect in with the NRM plans and support best practice? Is there a role for something like that, or do you think that would lead to the wrong outcomes?
Well, you know, again, as I mentioned earlier, you know, we're incredibly inclusive and encourage and accept and appreciate and value all of the approaches and practices and philosophies that our very diverse farmer stakeholder group practice and utilise every day. As to minimum standards, I reckon, Pete, you probably have a view of something like that. Peter seems to have frozen. Oh, there he is. If you take yourself off mute, Pete.
Yeah, minimum standards. I think most farmers are trying to do best practice at the moment, but I think what's often forgotten in some of this discussion is that the farmers are first and foremost trying to make a profit. And if we're going to have minimum standards and we're going to bring in some of the externalities of farming, which I think is necessary, we're going to have to somehow educate the public that there's a cost to some of this, and it's going to have to be paid for. Now, that might be paid for by ceasing production, or it might be paid for by increasing prices. I don't know which way it's going to go, but it's not a cost-free operation, and I think that's what gets in the road in many of these places when people start digging into the details.
You're on mute, Jennifer.
Thank you for sharing that. With the hubs structure, how do you integrate the Indigenous culture and communities into those hubs, Wendy?
Well, that's a really good question. It's right from the beginning. FCA, one of the founders was Joshua Gilbert, who is First Nations. Sorry, my dog's just going crazy in the background. And we've always had First Nations land management practices and fire management practices as well, as key to our approaches. Pete, I know, has specific experience with bushfire management, and did you want to sort of comment on incorporation of Indigenous practices into that, Pete?
That would be great.
Look, it's a complicated matter, and I think in many of these situations, it's recognising the complication that's part of the problem. I mean, I work with Indigenous community all the time in trying to work out what our practices should be, not just in bushfire management. And I think, to be frank, there's a lot we can learn from their farming methods and you know, the products that they were producing and a whole lot of things. But it's going to take a lot of extension. I think, you know, comments were made about the lack of extension services. I don't think many people in the farming community necessarily come into contact with the Indigenous community enough to understand what's actually happening there. So that bridge has got to be crossed. We've got to understand that the system has changed. Like that, they basically have a system of nil tenure before white men came along, and they lived on the land and they understood it intimately, and they conducted their practices, burning or whatever. You can't do that these days because we've got 5-acre blocks everywhere, and everybody's got a different view on whether they like the smoke or they don't like the smoke, or what the situation might be. So there's got to be a lot more rules. I mean, I hand out permits to burn all the time, and we're trying to get people to understand the timing that's required, what they're burning. You know, it's not just a simple matter of throwing a match out. And I think we've lost so much knowledge in that regard that it's going to take us a long while to get it back.
Yeah. And how do we get it back? What do you think is a solution from your experience, Peter?
Well, my experience coming through Landcare and all the other organisations that I've been in for the last 40 years, I think the community is absolutely critical. I think most farmers understand that they're part of a community. They're not, you know, islands on their own little farm doing their own little thing. So I think that's where we've got to start. We've got to start engaging with the whole community in your own village or your own town or wherever it is.
Yeah.
And get that discussion going. You know, like we've sort of become so wrapped up in our own individual lives, and we, you know, the whole culture of this, you know, modern world is we're all individuals. We can do what we like. You only got to look at America to see the mess that's got us. So, you know, we've got to get back to an understanding that we live in a community, and to be part of a community, we accept to do certain things that the community thinks is acceptable. And you know, and that requires a lot of hard discussion. You know, part of Farmers for Climate Action work is bringing groups together to discuss some of these issues. I mean, you know, I saw a question there a while ago about the regenerative agriculture and how diverse and divisive it is. And it is, but a lot of that's because of a misunderstanding of what's happening in the real world on farms, or what regenerative agricultural people are talking about. I mean, there's just a lot of definitions and language that creates a problem. I mean, I've been doing holistic management since '94 when we did with the course with Savory's group, and you know, I still grow crops, I still do a lot of things, and many people would look at it and say, oh, well, you're not regenerative, but maybe they're right, maybe they're not, who knows? You know, like, but we're doing a lot of what they're doing. I mean, I think there's a lot more we can do. I think there's still far too much country left without ground cover. You know, and we did that, you know, for the last 20 years. Fallowing's been a practice of, you know, chemical fallows to protect water so we could get the crop in. But it may be that we've been doing the wrong thing, and we need to start thinking about putting in a cover crop of some sort, because we might get a better result doing it that way. So you know, there's a lot of research and extension that still needs to be done.
Yeah, what I might do, because of cover crops and some of those practices, I might ask Louise to make some comments about, you know, what is regenerative agriculture to you, Louise?
Well, that's an interesting question, Jen, and I'm very embedded in the work of Savory and of the holistic context. And the context is unique for every person and for every farmer. And so it's a very pragmatic definition, to be honest with you. It's a recognition that there are many, many tools in the box, and there are no rules to those tools. It's just that a tool has a time and a place. And the important point is that as a manager of land, that you recognise the time and the place of that tool, and you understand the consequences of using that tool, intended, unintended consequences, and you maintain a pretty rigorous monitoring process to keep track of those things, and accept the consequences of whatever tool you use. With always in mind, or an understanding that you're always wanting to improve your environment, improve the health, improve the biodiversity. Farmers really care about their land, and they do have that intent. They do want to leave it behind in the best condition that they can. But I think in some cases they haven't been fully aware of the consequences of using certain tools. And I think when they have that real strong awareness, and that's scientific, their own experience with it, they can make more informed decisions. So I don't think it's about this way or that way. I just think it's about a really conscious decision about the way that you manage your land.
There was a comment made around community, and that has been a bit of a loss of that community feeling. Do you think regenerative agriculture can actually be something that will embrace building communities? Louise?
Well, I do believe that it's a very significant shift to become fully into that paradigm. And I do believe that it requires support from the entire ecosystem of actors within agriculture. There will be a need for more people on the land, which I think is a really wonderful thing. And there will be a need for people to work together to a collective vision that's very clearly articulated. And I think that those things are what can glue people together, glue communities together, glue families together. When we all are really clear about what it is that we want and we make decisions towards that. So yes, I think there's some incredible power in it.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. Brendan, just another question over to you. What do you think these enabling platforms are? What would be your vision in being able to help communities?
So I'm thinking mainly from a restoration perspective, on the assumption that we get the market-based mechanisms working in scale, supported by good application methods and improved execution, tech and data methodologies like Louise was speaking about there before, more methodologies. So the enabling platforms really is think about how so it happens a lot in the agricultural industry already, but in the sector we're talking about it, there's not a lot of mobilising platforms which deliver a more efficient connection of capital to on-ground execution. It's a very pipeline approach. You identify your project, usually when you get a grant, you collect your seed, you identify a landholder, you then go do your pre-planning, you do your ripping, you do your mounding, you look at when the best time to plant the trees, etc. So it's a really long process. I'm thinking about the role of platforms in creating a more efficient construction window and a more efficient deployment of capital. So let's think about the bushfires last year. I don't know the exact number of donated philanthropic corporate dollars that might have gone into the environment where people wanted to get into rehabilitation, recovery, etc. I don't know what the number was, but I'd actually really like to know how much of it's hit the ground already. And there's a lot of criticism of charities, in many instances, I think for wrong reasons, of not getting the money on the ground. But it takes a long time. Kate knows this. It takes a long time to get the money on the ground because it's a really elongated pipeline process. As I said, traditionally driven by grants, and we have very short windows. and traditionally driven by volunteers who are already doing 20 other things as well. So I'm thinking about those tools of technology, artificial intelligence, data capture, etc., that are aggregated into platforms. And then the platform actually thinks about resource modules, land modules, seed modules, capital models. So if an investor wants to go in. But there's another thing that I'm thinking about with platforms as well, is a lot of the work that's done in the environment space, and I'm not, I'm just thinking about the sector I know the best here, is a lot of the work's done in the environment space is on a push system. We're always pushing it out onto people. I'm thinking about platforms that actually create a pull system, where landholders are actually going in and making their own decisions around their own enterprise. Will I do soil carbon here? Will I do trees? And the data points them towards the best decision. And in some instances, the decision might be stewardship payment, soil carbon, run sheep, reduce lambing, stuff that's they're already doing. So thinking about how you integrate an ecosystem services model into other systems and other platforms that work, particularly in agriculture. So that's the way we're thinking about it. We've got a bit of money to do that already. Will we build this platform? We may never do it, but we think that it needs to be done. And ultimately, we put our resource to the platform that we think gets the most efficient connection of dollars, resources, innovation, tech, data, intellectual property into projects, which benefits all Australians. But as I said, principally is rewarding landholders for ecosystem services, which they are providing that the whole community benefits from.
Wonderful. No, I think that is very innovative, and I think that's really important in the enablement side, Brendan. I'm just looking at all these questions. I'll read this one out. This might be for Kate. She's had a bit of a rest. How do we get large, broad acre farmers to change their practice to a more sustainable footing that has the potential to enhance carbon in the landscape and at the same time build resilience to climate-related stresses? Kate, over to you.
Oh, that's a multi-million-dollar question too. And I also find that really interesting. So just pulling upon Brendan's thing of push as opposed to pull. So that question was framed in a way of getting other people to do something. So it's an interesting issue that comes up when people are trying to create practice change or researchers are trying to have their work adopted, and it generally is a case of why aren't those people doing it, as opposed to trying to understand what's the issue about what you're wanting me to do as to why I'm not doing it. So having that awareness of what are the actual barriers to people, and whether those barriers are, as Peter made the point, whether they're actually cost or profitability barriers, or whether they're barriers for the scale of change that's required, or the speed of change, or the value system clash, or there's so much work that's been done around those issues, right down even to someone's own self-identity or someone's skill sets. So look, there's a whole suite of things that need to go into place to actually help people do that. Brendan talked about giving people the options so that they're informed and they understand what some of those options are. But if they are then wanting to take on those options, you need to ensure that people have access to the capital or the skills, all of the things that we've talked about. And that's where I think, we've actually been doing some great stuff for quite a long while, and we've seen quite a lot of practice change in agriculture in Australia. So let's not underestimate that. I think the issue now is not just the scale of change, but the timing that we've got. Do you know what I mean? There's the speed of change that is now required because of some of the problems we're facing, and particularly if we're expecting agriculture to be a sequestration source for us. Then suddenly it's the speed that makes an issue. And Louise was very honest in talking about generational change, but I'm not sure we have time for generational change anymore. And that's where I think also Brendan talked about moving on from just grants-based to market-based instruments and incentives and those sorts of things. So I think there are a whole suite of tools in front of us. I think we've created more, we're getting better at it, but there is more to do. I also want to apologise for my answer because it always sounds so vague when you generalise like this. It's much better if you can pin it down to a specific example. But I do feel that one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet too are international drivers. that are actually helping create this change. And one of the things I've noticed and that we're trying to collaborate with industries on is actually sustainability frameworks that are also driven by the expectations of international markets. And this isn't just about the premium that Louise mentioned, this is about just maintaining access to markets because of the changed expectations of the entry point or the consumers. And you see that in Sustainable Development Goals and the way they're framed and the expectations that then come through some of the EU expectations. That all sounds really dry, but interestingly enough, when you see those drivers change and send different signals, you can have an incredible response from within Australia. And we are seeing that. We have in the past seen that change that's happened in several of our industries. I think we're now seeing that driver push people further. So that's about the push-pull, the incentives, the disincentives that people face and managing those, and us all playing our different roles, whether it's our role of education and planning or helping with practice change, whether it's the private sector with capital investment for practice change and changing market signals to producers, whether it's the government in setting up the right frameworks and helping us with the accountability mechanisms, because I still think the accountability mechanisms are problematic, and that there's a whole lot of investment in the data and the ongoing monitoring of that. All of those things need to come together. So final point, Jennifer, that brings us back to systems.
Yes.
And part of it sometimes is we can pick one little silver bullet and think we just need government to do this, or we just need the private sector to do this, or we just need, and of course it's never ever that simple. And the relationship between the parts of the system are just as important as each individual component. And I don't think we're very good at actually setting up those systems and understanding those systems.
And that's important for this question, because someone asked, how would someone restore a higher water catchment in an agricultural region, Kate? Because that would need a real systems approach to make sure it was done efficiently.
It would. And look, one thing I think it's very easy to talk about the win-win-wins, sorry to keep harping back to your talk, Brendan. But I also think we have to be really honest about the fact that it's not always going to be win-win-wins. And so we've talked a lot about agricultural landscapes. We haven't talked about conservation landscapes a lot yet. And we've talked about carbon, but we haven't talked about the fact that, you know what, a high carbon producing area is not necessarily a highly biodiverse area, and does not necessarily have the biodiversity multiple benefits that one would be seeking on the conservation benefits. So there's also not just the need to ensure that you're managing across a whole landscape spatially for that, but you actually do have to be able to collaborate and negotiate trade-offs. There are going to be times when within a landscape or even across a whole continent, you have to be prepared to trade off some things from others. And to do that, you need the appropriate mechanisms and frameworks right down to the grassroots level of people being able to negotiate these things at a very local level, right up to, you know, what happens nationally and the settings we put in place nationally. But we are going to be having to make some tough decisions about trade-offs, and we need to be really honest about that. And that comes to a farm level, a landscape level. If you are trying to regenerate a whole catchment, what are you trading off? You're going to trade off the amount of water that actually comes out the bottom if there's a township that relies upon that water supply, because you are maintaining more water in the landscape and in the vegetation. What does that then mean for that urban water supply? There are all of those sorts of things that we really need to understand, and that's why the spatial connectivity is important and the scaling connectivity, but also why we must have the capacity to collaborate and negotiate at local through to broader scales, because we won't be able to make those trade-offs and we will end up with conflict over diminishing resources.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. And we are running out of time, but there's a lot of questions around Internet of Things and biochar. There was a biochar session today, I understand. So that's probably why there's a lot of questions around that. Peter, in terms of the services that are needed, what type of services in terms of technology do you think farmers may need? And do you think biochar plays an important role for for the solution as well. So that's for Peter. Is Peter still there?
Well, yep, I'm still here. I think what Kate was just saying about systems is so critically important in breaking down these silos, because if I start on the biochar issue, we looked at biochar a long time ago. We've looked at many things, and eventually it comes down to the cost of being able to do this. And whilst I think biochar has got tremendous attributes, if you can't get it on the paddock at a reasonable cost, it's not going to happen. So you've got to, we've got to get some of these systems sorted as part of the process. Now, maybe if you've got a niche market and you've gone organic, or whatever marketing tool you're using, it can be done. But it's the reason it's not being taken up is because the cost of freighting it around and applying it and using it is still prohibitive. So that's happening. What services do I think we need? Well, I think, not to pick on the government, but I think the system of the NBN in the country is atrocious. We're trying to run markets here and trade, future prices for wheat and grain, because it takes us 12 months to grow a crop. So therefore, you've got to protect it and take out some hedging material. You can't do that over the phone. You've got to be on it daily on the internet. And if your internet doesn't work very quickly, or you can't send things out, or whatever else might happen, a lot of people in this country couldn't be on this call today because they don't have a sufficient internet speed to run a video. So, it's really critical. Most tractors these days that run on controlled traffic are talking about the change in cropping. Very few tractors would be driven by a farmer anymore. They've got a farmer sitting in them to make sure they don't run into something, but basically they drive down the paddock in a straight line driven by satellites. And some of them even turn around. I've seen systems where you don't even have to get the chaser bin to come up the headers. They'll just drive out, pick up the grain and drive back to the truck, empty it out. It's all automatic. Now, that's only going to happen if you've got a really good system, and we're falling behind in that area. And I think transferring of knowledge is absolutely critical, and that's part of it. So yeah, we need a much better system.
There's just so much product available, and making the choices and understanding what works and doesn't work as well, Peter, is, I think, part of the issues as well. And it'd be good to get Brendan's thoughts around that. Brendan, because I know that you're very much into the technology, Internet of Things. Would you like to make a comment around that?
Yeah, look, so a couple of things in that last group of questions is, I don't think I've had a single original idea in 9 years at Greening Australia. Anything that's worked, it's because the timing's been better now than it was 9 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Kate's exact point around, we're not coming from a standing start here. Most of the challenges that we're facing in our natural environment at the moment, which we identified natural capital solutions for, are all quite well understood and well studied, etc. There's some variance, like how things might change under under various climate regimes, etc. But it always comes down to timing and scale. Biochar works. There's no doubt about it. Biochar does work. But scaling it and making it affordable to the market is a very different kettle of fish. So it clearly needs more research. I worked in the aluminium industry a long time, and we got biofuel to work in our mine fleet, but we ran out of biofuel. And so we stopped using it. It's the same with a lot of what we're talking about here with ecosystem services and the scale that we want to operate, that I think we need technology to help assist with deployment and build those economies of scale. For example, when we plant trees, we go out at usually first sun up, and we get out on the ground about 7 o'clock. And we probably plant until our workers are physically exhausted, and they don't get replaced by another crew because it's dark. And we haven't got the technology out in the paddock to actually put lights all over the paddock to keep planting through the night. It's also cold, etc. There's a whole range of reasons why you can't. So your implementation window is very short. think about when you drive around the country at this time of year, harvest, you know, those machines are running, you know, on GPS, on systems, on technology, preloaded data, et cetera, contour mapping, et cetera, all the stuff we're talking about, they're running 24/7, et cetera. And there we are in the background plugging away with 𝗘𝗫𝗆𝗺𝗃𝗃s and tractors with direct seeders, et cetera. So that technology piece is really important. But we're also talking about the difference between an agricultural landscape with products that have been studied continuously for many centuries versus areas where we haven't quite taken the IP out of people's heads, data just yet. So that's part of the pathway. Remote internet sensing, remote internet can work to a certain extent, but probably not to the extent that delivers that scale that we're talking about. So I'll wrap it up in saying that the challenges around economies of scale in the natural capital sector are no different than they have been in other sectors, except in our sector, the sector we're talking about here, I don't think we use the right tools to actually unlock the problems. I think we go to knives for machine gun fights. So maybe some of those grants that go into programs should go into R&D, technology, innovation, etc. You're on mute, Jennifer.
One of the benefits in Australia is we do have one of those, the R&D benefits, but we just got to make it easier for people to be able to get access to it. Because I agree, I think the innovation side is really important. I will have to close. I haven't been able to answer everyone's questions, so I do apologise to people that haven't had their questions answered. But there were some great topics. I really appreciated having Peter involved today as a special guest. You helped with the male balance. So Brendan wasn't alone, Peter, which was really important, but it was good to have all that female energy as well. Thank you, Louise, because she only knew she was going to be a speaker an hour before the session today. So I think she did really well. But what I am thrilled about is just listening to everyone's thoughts and ideas about how much is in common, how much everyone's agreeing on, which is great because that's really important. If strategically we can agree on things and we can see similar ways in terms of being able to take things forward. And what I loved today also was the real focus around the collaboration side and seeing the different strengths that different groups had. You know, a focus on conservation, a focus on carbon markets, more of a focus on regen ag, and more of a focus on that systems thinking, or in advocacy and leadership on the advocacy side. We need all of these areas to happen. And we can only do that if we collaborate and make sure we support other organisations in doing their job the best that they can as well. But, you know, having listened to this panel today, it just gives me so much hope because everything that you're doing is amazing. The leadership is amazing. And thank you, each one of you, for your time today. You know, it's been such an honour being able to chair this session. I'd also like to thank Lisa, who's behind Better Futures Australia, and she's been doing all the hard work with Mel, who had been doing all the stuff on the IT side. But make sure that if you're not involved in Better Futures Australia, that you do register, and particularly register to be on this panel on the agricultural area, because we need everyone's input. Everybody has different ideas, you know, that can be incorporated, and it could be the simplest idea that can make such a big difference. So please sign up with Better Futures Australia. We also have a survey that's going to come out, and again, that's part of being able to give Lisa some ideas that you know, because we want to listen to everyone's ideas. There are a lot of questions, but through this survey, you can make sure that your voice is heard as well. So thank you everyone for listening today. Thank you for the panelists. Yeah, and looking forward to seeing all the wonderful things that everyone is doing and seeing that great collaboration and that systems thinking happening. Thank you and good evening, everyone.